Good morning. I am Barbara Fiske, the coordinator for Cedar Field Forum. It is my delight to welcome all our residents here in the Fellowship Hall and on live stream. Our guest speaker today is Scarlett Heinbuch. She has distinguished herself in the fields of financial services, women's financial health, and social norm theory. Today, though, she comes to us to tell us about NDE, near-death experience. A topic that seems to interest many of you, and that is why I am glad you are here to hear someone who knows about this subject. Her story involves resilience, faith, and the power of love. She will be sharing her deeply personal account of a near-death experience that changes the outlook of life for her. She offers us insights, comfort, and inspiration. Her story reminds us every moment is precious. Please join me in welcoming Scarlett Heinbuch. Please.
I'm going to take a breath and thank you, Barbara, for that wonderful introduction. It's like I was telling Barbara, I will use my professor voice for the students in the back who like to, you have to speak a little louder. So I hope everyone can hear me well. Is it a show of hands? Can you hear me okay? All right. Well, I really appreciate this opportunity to share with you today. As Barbara mentioned, I just retired, and I can say it here, from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and returned to Richmond and Chesterfield, which is my home and has been my home for the past 40 years. I'm very glad to have had that experience in a long career in finance and banking and working with women to plan for retirement. That was all very important to me. And as you might imagine, working in that field is a very different type of life than having a drowning experience at 4 years old, which is where I'm going to start about my near-death experience. Because at 4 years old, I did drown. This was in 1964, back in the day when there were lifeguards in school pool, in neighborhood pools, and that's where I was. Many of you may remember that we had to wear these kind of plastic swimming caps that had little scallops or daisies. They pulled your hair. They were very unpleasant, but they came in a bright pink. So girls generally had to wear these, and I, on that day in June of 1964, was wearing my pink cap. And on that day, I was in the shallow end with my older sister, who was 5, and my younger brother was in the kiddie pool. He was 18 months old, almost 2. And my mother, who is a nurse, or was a nurse at that time, was keeping an eye on us, but it was hard to watch my sister and I in the pool and my brother in the kiddie pool. But she was doing the best she could in keeping an eye, and there was also a lifeguard. So it was crowded, but this was the way it was. So I was in the shallow end where I had been instructed to stay, and I was bobbing up and down, but I did not realize as I continued to go backward, my feet didn't hit the bottom of the pool. And in that moment, I panicked, and I started to swallow water. And as I continued to swallow water, I continued to flail. Before I knew it, everything went dark. And the next thing I remember is the person that I knew as me is floating up, not my body, but my consciousness at the edge of the pool. And I am looking down at my body on the bottom of the pool, seeing that pink cap, and understanding that I am aware of that body, that there is a me outside of that body. And my mother, we talked about this years later. We didn't talk about it much then because it wasn't that unusual back then for people to drown in swimming pools, and it still isn't today. But what happened was my mother noticed that she did not see my pink cap, and she came over, saw that I was in the bottom of the pool, and came and got me. Now, she said later, she said, for a while, you weren't with us. And I knew I wasn't. I was blue and not breathing. She, as a nurse, knew how to revive me. So she turned me over on my side. She got the water out, and I came back. But there's something important here that I want to share at 4 years old. When you're 4 years old, you don't have an understanding of these words. You also don't know what's possible and what isn't because you're 4 years old. Every day is magical. Every day is an experience. So in my mind, this was just another experience. But in that experience of my consciousness being outside of my physical body, floating in that pool, hovering, I want to share with you something that happened. What happened was I was embraced in a sense of love and peace and contentment and security that defies wordly description. Even all these years later, it is very hard for me to be able to explain just the incredible joy of being in that loving energy field, if you will, for lack of a better term. And it was so amazing. I did not want to come back. And I also knew that I had a choice in that moment. I had a choice to not come back because I had died in the bottom of the pool. But what did happen was I also had this overwhelming feeling of compassion for my mother. I loved my mother dearly, and I was just so sad that I knew that if I didn't come back, she would never forgive herself. She would be hurting for the rest of her life and grieving my loss. And I knew that I could not allow that, or if I had a choice in the matter, and my love for her was stronger than my desire to stay in that peaceful, loving environment. And I say that with some qualifications. As Barbara pointed out, I'm sharing some very personal stories, but I imagine everyone in this room has been through some life experiences, so you'll understand. I grew up in an alcoholic home with my father drinking too much to mask his depression. So when I say that it was very tempting to stay in that place and to go on and not live this life, that is why. It was not an easy environment for me as a very young child to be in, and I didn't like it at all. It was frightening and hard. But my love for my mother was greater than all of that, and I came back. But here's the thing. You know, when we talk about near-death experiences, which I had, but I didn't have a term for it, there weren't words for it back then, we don't talk about the fact, well, there's a lot of question about whether it's real or not. Well, when you're 4 years old, I didn't question that it was real. I never questioned that there was love outside of my understanding. I never questioned that there was an amazing experience on that other side. And I never questioned that I was both of those beings. I was that consciousness hovering at the edge of the pool, as well as I was that body on the bottom of it. So I never questioned that. So when we come and we talk about near-death experiences and people ask if it's even real, I know it's real. I knew it at 4 years old. But what I did not know was how I was going to be able to live this life. Because what I found was this life, people weren't loving in many ways, and people often weren't kind. And that was frightening to me. You know, people didn't seem to understand what I knew at 4 years old, that there's incredible love, and we are all loved in a way we can't even understand. We can't even comprehend that kind of love. But so having that experience at 4 set me up for a world of life and where I always felt I was walking in two worlds. So when I share with you that I had a career in banking, Barbara may have mentioned, or it may be in my biography, I ended up getting my doctorate in public policy at Virginia Commonwealth University. I ended up getting a master's degree in public health at Virginia Commonwealth School of Medicine. All of these things I did because I wanted to be a more helpful person. Because when I came back and knowing that I had that choice, there was also an understanding that I came back to help people. I came back to share about what this love is like. And I came back with a purpose. And part of that purpose was to share these experiences. But what I learned in 1964 and 1965 and the years on was I could not talk about this because people didn't understand what I was talking about, and they just thought maybe it's a dream, or I'm a child, maybe I've misinterpreted or misunderstood my experience. And looking back, I understand why people would think that, because why wouldn't you? If it's not in the common landscape of thoughts and talking about, people don't know about it. So in 1975, Dr. Raymond Moody wrote a book called Life After Life. How many of you may have heard of that book? Show of hands. Oh, good. So there I was at 15 years old, and my mother handed me a copy of that book. I devoured it in one day because what I found was other people had had my experience. And I felt like I wasn't alone with it anymore. And he gave it a title, he gave it a name, near-death experience, NDE. And I thought, finally, I have a name for something that happened to me, and now I can understand it, and other people can understand it. And that was so revolutionizing to me in my mind. It was just, well, revolutionary, rather, in my mind, that there was a name. So as the years wore on, and I need to also say that at having that experience and being exposed to that love of the other side, one of the things that also happened was that doorway to the other side stayed opened. And I was unprepared for the after effects that we now know are classic with near-death experiences, whether you're an adult or a child. But when you are a child, these experiences are more profound because, again, you don't question anything. Not at 4 and 5 years old. You just do not. And so when these experiences happen where you know things that there's no possible way you could know, you don't question it. You just know it. It's just things that you know. When frightening things happen, perhaps like in my experience, if a family member passed away, I might see their spirit at my bedside. And that happened with my mother's only sister, who was 12 years older than her, my Aunt Marguerite. I've written a book about it, and I use a different name for her because at the time when I wrote the book, her only living son was still alive, and he's not with us any longer. So he would be okay with me mentioning his mother. But when my aunt died in 1975, also that same year, my mother took it terribly bad. Because of the age gap and being her only sister, she felt like her sister was more her mother. And so my mother began to drink. She was extremely depressed, and she was going through a very, very dark time. And we didn't know how to help her as my brother and sister. We didn't know what to do to help her with her grief. But what we tried to do was just be there for her. But when someone's grieving that hard, there's nothing anybody can do to get through. So my aunt appeared to me at my bedside in a dream, and I saw her, and she did not look good. She looked scary to me, and I was terrified. But what she said to me was, "Please tell your mother to stop grieving. She's holding me back." And I thought about that, and I told my mother what had happened, and my mother just couldn't hear me. Then my grandmother, the mother of both my mom and my Aunt Marguerite, was a Pennsylvania Dutch woman. And she came into an understanding from her heritage that that people could communicate with people who had passed on. So she didn't really think that was too unusual. But what happened for her was she told my mother the same thing, that my Aunt Marguerite had come to her bedside, but Grandma was not asleep. She saw her, and Aunt Marguerite said the same thing. Please tell Doris, that's my mother's name, to stop grieving. She's holding me back. And what she meant by that was not that she was upset that my mother was holding her back, but that she loved my mother so much, her grief was hurting my aunt. She wanted her to know she was okay, that she was on the other side, that she was ready to go on. But her love for my mother was so great, she just didn't want her to suffer. She wanted her to know she was okay. But Mom still could not get over her pain with this. And again, we didn't know what to happen. So about months went by, my mother's still grieving, and then something happened that I didn't know could happen. Now, and when I tell you about it, you'll know that these things do happen. But in 1976, later that year in the spring, and let me back up a little bit. I grew up in the country. Back then, they had what they call a party line. Is anyone familiar with that? So that meant that when you picked up the phone, you could be hearing somebody's conversation, or the person who ran the party line could be listening to yours. So it wasn't, it was kind of like a community phone. And so I was home. I had gotten out of school. I had an early dismissal. I was in high school at this point. And no one was home. My sister had an activity. My brother did. Dad was at his job, and Mom was working at the hospital in Fredericksburg. So it's middle afternoon, and I hear we have one of those black phones, the rotary dial that no one knows unless you're our age or older what they are, and the phone rang in the middle of the afternoon. So I went to go answer that phone, and I hear this crackling noise, and I think, well, just a bad reception on the party line. And I'm saying hello, hello, and I'm waiting to hear if someone's going to say anything. And then I hear the voice of my aunt, who is dead. And she says, hello, Scarlett. She says my name. And I'm at this point totally shocked, questioning what I'm hearing. And I'm saying, hello, Aunt Marguerite? And she says, yes, honey. And I said, you're dead. And she said, I know, but please tell your mother, please tell her to stop grieving. I'm okay. Well, I'd like to tell you I continued the conversation, but I did not. I was so scared, and every prickle in my body was just like goosebumps from head to toe. And I slammed the phone down, and I ran outside where it was sun shining and wondering what had happened. At first I thought, like you would think, this is unbelievable, this is impossible, someone might be playing a prank, but no one did pranks like that in 1975, and certainly nobody really knew our family because we lived in the country, and so nobody would have done that. And so I am so unnerved by this experience because I had never heard of that. Well, now you're not probably surprised to hear there's lots of books out there about phone calls from the dead. There's books out there about how spirits can use electronic media and mediums to get through to people. So now it seems to be old hat, but back then it wasn't to me, and it was really terrifying. Well, I relayed this message again to my mother, and I think finally, when I'm telling her, and she saw my fright, and she saw how real it was, and I said, Mom, you have got to hear this message. You've got to understand that your sister loves you so much, but she's okay, and she wants you to be okay. Can you find it in your way to let her go? Can you let her move on? Can you let her be in the love that she's in right now and understand that she's there? Because she really wants you to get this message, and she's scaring me. And she doesn't mean to, but by the way, her desperation to communicate this message to you through me is scaring me, and your mother too. Mom finally got the message, but it took a long time. And also I have to say too, I tried to talk about what had happened again in 1975, 76 with these things, But who could I talk to? There wasn't anyone who really could understand what had happened because this was not in the mainstream news. People didn't talk about these experiences. So when I say that, what I'm saying is that I grew up feeling pretty isolated and alone as a child and not sure how I could help people and why I was even having these experiences. Life went on as it usually does, and even with being a sensitive child with some of these gifts, and I put that in air quotes, I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I just knew I was meant to help people in some way. And what I ended up doing was messing up my life in every way that people do. Having grown up, as I mentioned, in an alcoholic home, I did not often see a good example of what a healthy relationship would look like. And so I found myself in relationships that were not healthy. And so what tended to happen was, even with all of that spiritual awareness, it didn't shield me from making mistakes in relationships or making mistakes in life. In 1988, I had dropped out of college. I was drifting. I wasn't really sure where I was going to go. And I found that I ended up becoming pregnant with my son, who's now 37. And I faced that choice of what to do as a single parent and chose to have him. And he had birth difficulties and some issues that created what they called a blue baby, where he had oxygen deprivation at birth, and he also had to be revived. He was born blue. He was not breathing. And it took a while to revive him, and they warned me that he would have problems for the rest of his life, most likely because of the anoxia that he had experienced from the traumatic birth. So I didn't know why I was going to have this experience, but that's what happened. We stumbled along in life. At 2 years old, he was diagnosed with severe ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, learning disabilities, and all sorts of things. And so we just tried to figure out how to help him, what school situation he might need, how I could keep a job as a single parent. It was very difficult because his behaviors were so hard that he would get kicked out of school. Even back then, they had started with education plans for special needs kids, but he needed so much. So life was tough, and I continued to try to hope for the best. I met somebody and remarried and had my next son. Well, again, neurological issues with him. Everything had gone well with the pregnancy, and yet when he was born at 2, he showed signs of epilepsy. Well, his maternal grandmother had epilepsy, so there was a genetic link to that. So both boys had all these problems, and here I was. My marriage failed at that point because my husband at the time could not handle all the problems with the children and all their needs, and it was very daunting. If any of you have had anybody with a special needs in your family, you probably know what I'm talking about. It's very challenging. So I ended up finishing up my undergraduate degree to help my children, and then I went on and got my master's in public health to help my children, because I felt that children with special needs deserved better than what they were getting in the schools and in the medical field. And then I was working as a compensation analyst at a major corporation, a Fortune 50 company here in Richmond, and then I got an offer to go earn my PhD in public policy with a full stipend. And the only thing would be that I'd have to quit my job and go to school full time. Well, as a single parent, I had no idea how that was going to work, because the stipend really wasn't enough to cover my mortgage and all the other things that I had on my plate. But I ended up doing some health coaching with a woman who had survived cancer, and encouraged her to do walking and take some nutrients to help supplement her body. And she got so much better that she said, well, how can I help you? And so what happened was she had turned out to be a financial advisor for American Express. And so she sat down with me and showed me how I could move money around like water so that I could support myself to go to school. She said, you take an equity line on your condo, you can go to school, and then it will be worth it because you'll be able to pay it back. She said, I would never ordinarily advise this, but because this is a short-term pain for a long-term gain, that's how she said it, it will be worth it and your life will change in ways you can never expect. So I said, okay, I'm going to do it. So I did. Now, along the way, I'd finished all of my dissertation work. Well, not my dissertation work. I'd finished all my coursework. And then what happened was I was ready for the next big experience of my life. I ended up talking because, as I mentioned, growing up in an alcoholic home, one of the things I'd seen when people are stressed was to turn to drinking. So having had that experience in my family, I knew I was at risk, but still I found myself drinking too much wine, and I became concerned. Now, I'm not going to say I got a DUI because none of that happened, but because I felt worried about my own drinking, knowing that we have a propensity to alcoholism in our family, I was like, I don't want to go down this road. And so I took myself to some 12-step meetings to make sure, I addressed this. Because one of the things I learned was we're all going to have problems in life. It's how we deal with them that is going to make all the difference in what happens next. So I went to that meeting, and I met some wonderful people. But being a single parent now, I'm in my PhD program, I stopped going because I realized, well, I'm just not going to be drinking, and that's the end of that. Well, I've met some wonderful people, as I mentioned, and months later, I've been hearing about a man who had come in from the West Coast who was in that meeting, and just a wonderful person, and had gotten horribly sick to the point that he was now in the hospital in the intensive care unit and was dying with an unexplained illness that people just didn't know what to do about. So a friend of mine who had gone to that same meeting called me and said, hey, I'm going to be picking up my 20-year coin tonight, and I'd really like for you to be there. So I decided to go that night, and as fate would have it, that man's mother had been called to come from San Francisco to say goodbye to her son, who had been in an unresponsive coma for over 3 weeks, going on 4 weeks, and to say goodbye because he had taken a turn for the worse and he was not going to survive. So I met her that night at the meeting, and when I came in, people were standing around crying about this bad news about this man. And his mother, her name is Dee, stood there thanking everyone for the care that they had shown her son and how important it was to her, that they know how much she appreciated all that they had done. Because people in that meeting would take meetings to this man at St. Mary's Hospital in the ICU every day. And they had done this faithfully for 3.5 weeks. And something about her stoicism, her grace in this moment of her own pain just touched my heart. And she had said, she had just signed the funeral directives at the hospital, and after flying in from San Francisco that later that afternoon, and had come to this meeting to say thank you to everybody, and that it was too late for her son. It was one of those moments at the end of the meeting where I went up to her and I was going to say how sorry I was, but what came out of my mouth was something different. And I said to her, I don't think you should give up hope yet. Now, I don't know why I said that. I did not even know her son. I had never met him. I didn't know really anything about his condition except that he was dying, but I didn't really even know from what. And then immediately I'm questioning, why did I say that? I don't know, again, I don't know this woman, I don't know this man, I don't know anything. Why did I even say that? But at the time, as I mentioned with my sons, one of the things that I had trained in was Reiki. Have any of you all ever heard of that? It's energy healing. My mother had trained me in the nursing method that they use, which was therapeutic touch. It's very similar. You're working with the body's energy field. But Reiki is the non-nursing model for anybody who wants to learn it. So I had learned it to help my sons, to calm them when my son had a seizure or when my other son was having a meltdown, I would call it. So I offered to go see her son if she would like me to, and at the time I was on the prayer team at the church I was attending, and I said, if you would like me to, I can hold his hand. I am not afraid of people dying, and if he's going to go, I'll hold his hand and say a prayer with him if you would like me to. And so because he was in the ICU, she would have to give me permission to go. And there was the big question mark. This was 7:30, 8:30 on a Thursday night, September 22nd, 2005. So I didn't even know if her son would be alive the next day to even fulfill what I offered to do. So I was teaching a class as an adjunct professor. In addition to being a student, I had to get special permission to teach the class on a marriage and family relationships, an upper-level sociology course. And I'd gotten the class because I was telling them I've made every mistake you can possibly make, so I can at least tell students what not to do. And so they gave me this opportunity. The class was amazing because I learned so much from the students and learned that a lot of what I had experienced in my life, they too were. And they were very interested in spirituality. They were very interested in relationships. And so these were all things that I had learned about as well. And so at this point, let me frame it up for you. I'm 45 years old. I've given up on love. I've given up on anything except just getting my PhD, getting my boys into the best health I could help them to be. I was researching essential fatty acids for brain health and my master's program. So I was really passionate about health education and helping people. So I thought, well, maybe that's my path. So I had a class to teach on that Friday, September 23rd at noon. At the end of the class, I called the hospital to see if the man was still alive because I barely had gas in my car to make it there. So I wasn't going to go if he wasn't even there, but he was. So I went there to go and say a prayer for this man. And so that decision, and in that moment, changed the course of my life and my destiny, as things do when we make a decision that seems unusual for our life at that time. So I showed up in that hospital room to see someone that, again, I did not know, who was in respiratory failure, who had a chest tube from one lung collapsing. He had double pneumonia. He had sepsis. He had heart arrhythmia. He was in a paralytic, unresponsive coma. His kidneys had completely failed, and I had never seen anyone in acute kidney failure, so I did not know that the body bloats up. So he was extremely swollen. The catheter bag was bone dry. There was no response. He had a ventilator tube down his throat that had been in there for the past 3.5 weeks. Back then, 20-some years ago, they didn't do the trach, or they figured that he was going to go anyway. So he still had the tube. He had the feeding tube in his nose. He had a central line in his neck. He had the pulse oximeter. He had IVs. He had every piece of machinery and equipment keeping him breathing, but he was gone. He was just not in his body. And what had happened, why his mother got the call, was because of the longer use of the ventilator, he had gotten less oxygen to his brain, so now he had brain encephalopathy, where he was now brain injured on top of everything else. What they finally diagnosed him with after 2 weeks was a very rare form of vasculitis called, at that time, Wegener's granulomatosis. That means that he had granulomas, like little nodules that formed on the organs. Now, where it was particularly devastating was on his kidneys, because when the granulomas formed in there, they created scar tissue and damage. And they explained to his mother and to me later that because of that damage, his kidneys would never heal. They might regain a tiny bit of function, but if he even lived, he would have to be on dialysis for the rest of his life. He would not ever be eligible for a transplant because people who have what he had only live at best 8 years, if he even survives. So that's what he was looking at, and that's what I heard at the time. So I did not realize how devastating all of this was And if I'd known, I probably would not have gone to the hospital because I would have thought, well, what can I possibly do to help? And I don't know exactly when he's going to go, so what could I do? But I showed up that day. And what I did was I very gently took his hand, careful not to dislodge anything. And my mother, as a nurse, had told me, whenever someone is unconscious or in a coma, you talk to them like they're awake. So what I did was I introduced myself because I'm a complete stranger to him as he is to me. And I told him who I was. I told him I had met his mother the night before at that meeting, and I told him the reason I was there was because a lot of people loved him and cared about him, including his mother. And if he decided he might have some unfinished business and wanted to stick around, I would try my very best to help him. But if he decided that he was ready to go, that would be okay too, and that I wanted him to know that my experience of love from my near-death experience before was so huge that there was nothing he could have ever done in this life that God would not love him, that his Creator would not love him. And so I took his hand and I began doing what I could with trying to do a little bit of energy work, and he didn't really respond. But what I did feel was a sense of his feelings. I felt his pain and his shame. I felt he had not made some good choices in his life. And my heart just opened in that experience. And I was like, oh, gosh, you know, if you could only know how much love is for you on this other side. So I finished up after 20 minutes, and I was getting ready to leave. And I took his hand to say a final prayer out loud, thanking God for this time. And again, what came out of my mouth was a promise. And the promise I made him, and I still didn't know why I was I'm here to help. If you decide, and again, it was his decision, if you decide you want to stick around, I promise you I will come back and I will see you through this. And if you don't, I will pray that you go into that love and that light, and that you go well and understand that all is well. As I was getting ready to take my hand away from his, he had no grip. He had never responded, but I could not remove my hand. It was like he had fused it. And I realized in that moment his spirit was reaching back. So I stood there for a moment, and I was so surprised, I laughed out loud. And I was like, oh my gosh, he's reaching back. And I said, I repeated my promise. If you're still here tomorrow, I will be back. Well, he was. So what happened over the 12-day period was I came back. And on about the third day, something very unusual happened. I was standing at his bedside holding his hand. I had just said my prayer. And as I'd mentioned before, when I was forward and drowned, I had that shift of consciousness where I'm out of my body, seeing my body on the bottom of the pool. Something similar happened, only this time I'm conscious, not on the bottom of the pool. All of a sudden, my consciousness shifted, and I am in a realm of love and light so enormous. To this day, 20-some years later, words fail me to describe how incredible that love is, how amazing that kind of love is. There aren't words to describe it, so I do my very best. But what happened was, I'm holding his hand in the physical world. He's still in the coma. He's never responded. And there I am, holding his hand in the spirit world, where he is hovering outside of his body, ready to go. And in that moment, my spirit, a man I'd never met in this life, knew him. I knew everything about him. I knew I loved him. I knew I'd always loved him. We were in like what we call a forever time. And he knew me. There were no words exchanged. I say it's like being in liquid love, like millions of dots of white liquid light love. But there's no texture on that side. It's not wet. I don't know how to describe it, but that's the best way I can say it. He wasn't in a tunnel because he had not had a catastrophic death experience, which is what tends to happen when you hear about near-death experiences and people go into the tunnel, into the light. But he had not yet physically died. He was on the end of life and near death. And in the longer-term coma, he was floating outside of his body, ready to go. He was just waiting for his body to completely shut down. But there he was, and there I was, and we recognized we loved each other. Now, when I talk about this experience, I don't know how much actual physical time happened, because on that other side, as you may, if you read about it, time changes, time stretches. But it couldn't have been but a few seconds or a minute at the most. And the next thing I know, I'm standing back at his bedside, holding his hand. He's still unresponsive. And I'm realizing I'm looking at my soulmate who's dying, and I don't even understand how this has happened or what I'm supposed to do with this. But like all of us, I want to have this for the rest of my life, that kind of love that now I have a glimpse of. But I cannot see any possible way that this person is that person. How can this be? Because I really don't think he's going to make it. And even if he did, he's not on my checklist. As I said, I'm teaching the marriage and family class. I didn't know anything about him, but he was in the middle of getting a divorce, which I later found out. So I'd always told my students, you don't want to be with somebody who's just getting a divorce. They have too much to work through, so don't do that. He was facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical bills because at the time he was a contractor and he didn't have health insurance. So one of the things, well, you don't want someone who's in a financially bad situation. Check, mark that off your list. But there it was. You don't want someone with a health condition, because you'll be dealing with that too. Make sure that you're aware of what that's going to involve. So cross that off my list. Also, we were two different faiths. I had been raised in a Christian faith. I was going to a pretty much a non-denominational Christian faith church, and this man was Jewish. So I thought, well, we're not aligned spiritually, so that can often, many people do have interfaith marriages, but I wasn't sure if that would be what we'd want. How would he accept my faith, and would I be, good for him? So I was like, so I crossed that off my list. So everything that I was telling my students you don't want to do, here it was. Here was my lesson. Another thing happened that it took me 10 years to even talk about, and I'll share it with you too. Because now, again, all of this stuff is coming out. There's books and books about everything I'm telling you, but at the time there weren't. As having that experience of being out of my body enabled me to be able to see things from that perspective forever. It's not something I have control over, but it is something that happens. So one night when I'm in my room, this is probably day 5 or 6 with David, he still has not woken up, he's still not responded, although he's still producing just a tiny bit of urine, which is good, but not enough. I was getting ready to go to sleep, and my mind again shifted, where I saw myself in his hospital room, like the virtual fly in the corner of the room, and I saw 4 beings around his cot, one on each end and each side, and in my perception, they appeared to be colored bluish and head to toe. They looked like a medical team, and they were working on David. I saw what appeared, again, I say appeared, and what I perceived, right? Because this is just what I'm perceiving. What I saw was a set of kidneys descending into his body, energetic, they were blue, into his body through his skin, and this team working on him. And I thought, well, I'm falling asleep, I must be having that kind of weird dream space. But what happened was, I call him the lead doctor, looked up and nodded where I felt myself hovering, and like he saw me, and I say he, it's hard to say, but nodded like, well, we've got this. So I'm like, what am I experiencing here? This is totally out of the realm of anything I've ever read about or experienced. So I'm then as things happen, I was back in my room, I'm falling asleep, and I just fall asleep. And I wake up early the next morning wondering, what the heck happened? Was this some sort of strange dream? Except I go into the hospital, and David is his name. His nephrologist is there with a puzzled look on his face, and he's saying, well, we don't quite understand what's happening here, but David's kidneys are regaining significant functioning. And then the next day, the doctor and the other doctors, at that point he'd had 11 consultations, and the nurses in the ICU started calling him Miracle Boy, because what had happened was his kidneys continued to exponentially heal, which was not possible given the scar tissue and the level of damage, and they'd already said this. So by the 7th and 8th day, his kidneys had regained full function. And there, again, the doctors said, well, we cannot explain this. They're not going to call it a miracle necessarily, but they're calling him Miracle Boy. And that's when we began to really understand that something amazing was happening in this experience. So as we continued on, I worked with him for 12 days. He made a stunning, unexplained recovery. He still had a long way to go because that level of injury takes time to recover. It took him at least 2 years to get his breathing back to normal from all the damage from the lung area. He had very advanced Wegener's. They now call it something different, but there's only 1 in 500 cases generally a year, or there were at that time. So it's rare, and that's why it took them so long to figure out what it was he had. And by the time they figured it out, he did not respond to the treatment protocol. Also, he had blood clots. I'd failed to mention that, and they gave him heparin, and he had an allergic reaction to that also. So he just had a terrible time with this. So what ended up happening was he did make that just stunning recovery, and when he woke up, again, he's a complete stranger in this life to me, and I to him, and he said he knew when he opened his eyes and saw me there, he knew everything about me. He knew he was in love with me. He knew he was going to marry me. He knew all of these things. He knew about my struggles. He knew about my children. He knew about everything that had happened in my life, and he knew that that was everything that he was going to do and to step in and help me on this next phase. So we didn't have a name for what happened, but he came out of the hospital in October of 2005. He had a relapse with the pneumonia. The immunosuppressant medication they gave him was so strong, he got sick again and nearly died again in November. And he was at this time, 20 years ago, he was in the hospital at St. Mary's ICU again, dying again. And I went to go see him one last time to thank him, because at that point, he had shown me a glimpse of the kind of love that is possible. And I did not want him to go, but I had to understand that love is not selfish. This kind of love is not selfish. This kind of love wants what's best for the person, even if it didn't mean that he would stay in this life with me. And I had to understand that that's what that love called of me, to want what was best for him. So that's what happened. He ended up I went and worked with him, and he also made another stunning recovery. And he got out of the hospital at Thanksgiving. Shortly after Thanksgiving, I took him turkey in the hospital for Thanksgiving. And then he came back. And then in December, we knew that we were meant to be together. And then in June of 2006, we got married. So 20 years now it's been since this has happened. His kidneys are perfectly fine still today. He's had some health challenges along the way that we all have as we get older, but he is a walking miracle. He's outlived every prognosis he had of 8 years. He's now going on 20. We have been very, very blessed to have the life we walked together for the past 20 years. I did finish my PhD. I ended up with this career in financial services because of him. I changed my direction, and I have loved it. And we ended up just having the kind of life that we feel is a gift. Does that mean it's been easy? No, it has not. We had my sons to deal with, but he stepped in and was a wonderful stepfather to them. He understood. He did not ever get upset about things that would upset other people because he was more patient because of his near-death experience. And we came up with a term called shared near-death experience because he didn't die. He came back from it, and I shared with him in that consciousness where he was. Now, what's interesting was in September, I went out to the International Association of Near-Death Studies conference that was held in Chicago this year. And Dr. Raymond Moody was there, and he was the keynote speaker celebrating the 50th anniversary of his book. I got to meet Dr. Moody, and I got to share with him our story. And Dr. Moody had also come up with a term called shared death experience. And this is where people are with someone's at the bedside where someone is dying and they die, and someone has the same consciousness experience that I had with David, where they're kind of halfway there. They can't go all the way because the person has passed on. But nurses are reporting these experiences, family members. You don't even have to love this person. It just spontaneously tends to happen. So Dr. Moody wrote another book a few years back called Glimpses of Eternity, documenting this new term, shared death experience, and this phenomena. So I shared with Dr. Moody, I said, well, what about the people who don't die, who have the near-death experience, and someone shares in that with them, like what happened with me with David? I said, I think the term shared near-death experience captures that gap. What do you think? And he said, I agree. And that's how Dr. Moody is. He's a thoughtful, brilliant man who's humble and open to ideas. And he said, I agree. So he said, I want you to talk to the shared death experience group. And he said, maybe you need to lead that research, the shared near-death experience, because we're hearing more and more about it. And someone, after he talked, asked the question about blue beings. And when David and I had given a talk to IANS in 2010, 10 years after the experience, we mentioned it very tentatively, rather nervously. And people were saying, we've been hearing about this all over the world. And so then again, as had been the story of my life, maybe I'm a little ahead of things, but people are talking about these experiences I've had, and now I don't feel so weird. They're having them too. And now when you hear this man, Dr. Moody, who has put this language on the table for all of us and talking about these blue beings too, it's come full circle. It's very moving for me all these years later, 50 years later, to see now here we are. So we're on the edge of a new understanding of our capabilities and consciousness, but the most important thing is we're on the edge of understanding even more how important it is to understand love and to understand that there is so much love and so much grace and so much enormous peace on the other side. And I have been there twice now, one in my own near-death experience and then having the gift to share with David. We're no longer afraid of death. We just know living this life can be very hard. We know from experience what is on the other side. But we're all here today, and we're all living our lives. And so the message I do want to leave, again, is how much love there is for you. And the same thing that I told David, the truth of those words, you don't get to our ages without having regrets or worries about things that we've done in our lives. Will we be judged? How will things be when it's our turn to go? And what I told David is the truth then as it is now. There is nothing you could have done in this life that your Creator doesn't love you. And if you are a parent and you have your children and you love them and the same way, that is the kind of love on the other side times a zillion, if you could even imagine that kind of love for you. And that's the message I'm going to leave with you today, that I am not a special person. I've had some unusual experiences, but the reason I'm talking about it today is because I look at our world, we're in a tough place. And I believe that having the courage to stand before people like you who are smart and capable, you've all lived lives of meaning and purpose, that it's important to remind ourselves about the importance of love. Because if we don't love each other, if we don't treat each other as a human family, we have missed the mark. And that's what sin is, isn't it? Missing the mark. So I want to remind people that love is the question, love is the answer, and you are all loved beyond your greatest imagination. Thank you. Yeah.
We can't thank Scarlett enough for this absolutely fascinating, remarkable story. We thank you sincerely for coming here and sharing with us today. She's willing to take a few more questions. Vicki Hahn will be on this side, and I'll be on that side. If you have a question, please state it now. Repeat the question. This is typical Cedarfield, reluctance to ask a question. Say it.
I don't have a question. I had an experience. I share with you all of it.
1 minute. It's on.
Okay.
Close to the mouth.
All right. I grew up in Lynchburg, Virginia, and grew up with a really dear friend. He acted as my brother, and we ended up going to college, different colleges. He ended up in Georgia. I ended up in Alabama, and I started to notice that every time I thought of him, he called me, and so I said to him, "Quit calling me, and for 1 year, I'm going to keep up with this, and you do the same, and let's see what." After 1 year, 78% of the time, we were within 1 minute of each other. And so later on in life, I got a call from him late at night saying that he was dying. And it was late, and I said to Bobby, "I'll call him in the morning." Well, at 3 o'clock, I woke up and I knew he was dead. And so, I'm laying there and I say, "All right, Bucky, let's try this one more time. If you're in a better place, I want a sign." And that sign is, I've never had a bird peck on my window, but I want a bird to peck on my window before I wake up. And so I'm a pretty sound sleeper. And so I wake up the next morning at about 5 o'clock, and she isn't in bed with me. So I go into the kitchen and I say, "What are you doing up?" And she said, "You didn't hear that bird pecking on the window?" I said, "Uh-oh." That's my story.
Would you like to summarize that story for the people on our live stream, please?
Yes, this gentleman was sharing about his dear friend who they'd think about each other, and he'd think about him, and his friend would call, and this went on for some time, all the time, and then he and his friend agreed not to speak for a while, and then his friend called him late at night to say that he was dying. And this gentleman said that he woke up around 3 in the morning, I hope I'm summarizing it correctly, and he just knew his friend had passed. And that he said he gave him a challenge, which is, if you're in a better place, have a bird peck on my window, because in all the time he lived there, no bird had ever pecked on his window. And so he's a sound sleeper, but his wife said, "Did you hear that bird pecking the window really loudly?" And so he knew from that his friend was in a better place. Did I recapture that correctly? Thank you.
One more question or observation?
Well, it's lunchtime, so I know that as a speaker, that's always the divine place, right? Everybody's ready to go eat. I do want to let you know, I did write a book. The second, this is the second edition, only because, and I didn't get a chance to say this, we were on a TV show called The Unexplained with William Shatner, who used to be Captain Kirk. And we were on the first season in 2019. And what they ended up doing was saying that I claimed to be a great healer, which I had never done. As you can imagine, that opened the floodgates worldwide for people to reach out for healing, which broke my heart because I couldn't help them. So I ended up writing a second edition of the book to explain what happened and to set the record straight. And I also want to verify, credibility is incredibly important to me. So David's medical records were not only reviewed by the TV show's medical team, which I appreciated, they've also been reviewed by a local physician who is an instructor in a medical college, or had been formerly, to verify that everything I'm saying is true. And he pointed out to me how even worse things were than I even realized when he reviewed the records. He said, I do not understand how he even survived and how he's going this well today. So those reviews, that review is in here, all of this is here. Plus, people ask me repeatedly, what prayers did you say to David? So I actually put the actual prayers I said in here, along with a bunch of resources about all the information out there now, just to make it more educational. And so I gave a special price for the book today. It's $16.95 on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, whatever. And for any copies I brought today, it's $12. It's a little discounted rate, or 2 for $10. And all the proceeds, trust me, as a writer, you don't make much money, and I haven't. I'm donating all proceeds, though, to the Chesterfield Food Bank this year. So if you do get the book, the $5 that I would get is going to the food bank. So again, thank you for having me. And I know it's a lot, but you know, Barbara can share my email, and if you have follow-up questions or want to talk about something, I'm available. Thank you.
Cedarfield Forum will not meet in December. Come back in January for the VMFA director. Thank you. Have a great day.